What irritates me the most is the horse laugh, people who just try to, dismiss you without ever having to consider or think about what you have to say because it's so ridiculous to them. So I particularly like to focus on areas that I call of high strangeness, things that are so strange that your instinctive response is to say, that can't possibly be true. Those are the things that are often the most important to take a good look at.
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness. It's Luciano here speaking as your host. I want to, as per usual, I want to ask the listener, new and old, please subscribe, share with your family and friends, and leave a rating as well. Feel free to take however long you want in your rating. What we are really appreciative about is your support, and just coming on and listening to our conversations is quite frankly support enough, because this is how we have been growing, and this is what's providing us the confidence in moving forward and asking the questions that we're asking of our guests. And as our veteran listeners know, we're having on folks more and more who are asking the questions that we had no idea we could ask, and they've been doing it for a long time. And we want to learn from that line of questioning and push the message forward. So it's about the what ifs and why nots of life, because quite frankly, why not? So this is why we're here. Last request. Our listeners know that we are a not-for-profit. We're a charity. We all volunteer our time here. And you can feel free, if you're so inclined, to donate. You can go to our website, behindgreatness.org, and find all the fun steps for that as well. So here we go with our next conversation. We're welcoming Jeffrey Mishlove, who is joining us from his home in New Mexico. Jeffrey is the host and producer of the New Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube, and not just on YouTube, but we'll talk about that too in a few minutes. He is the author of The Roots of Consciousness, Psi Development Systems, and The PK Man. He is a recipient of a doctoral diploma in parapsychology from the University of California, Berkeley, awarded in 1980. He is a grand prize winner of the Bigelow Institute essay competition regarding postmortem survival of human consciousness. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
We had a couple of people who were on the podcast who were judges of that Bigelow Institute essay competition. So that would have been Jeffrey Kripal and Leslie Kane. And then we also had a runner-up, Sharon Rowlett. I'm not sure if you've met Sharon Rowlett yet.
Mm-hmm.
You have? Okay, wonderful.
I've interviewed her on New Thinking Aloud.
Oh, okay. Well, that's my bad. I should have known that because I'm a fan of your show. Yeah. So why don't we talk about thinking aloud for a moment? Because it's been, I told you this before in our last conversation. I have been a fan of your show only really the last few years, because that's when I discovered it on YouTube, obviously. But you've had that show for a very long time.
Well, there are two shows, actually. The original Thinking Aloud series was on public television all across North America, on the satellite, at one time carried by 120 stations. And that ran from 1987 to 2002. It was called Thinking Aloud. Then in 2015, I launched the YouTube channel, and I thought I would build on what we had already done on public television. And so it's called New Thinking Aloud. And we've been out on YouTube now for going on 9 years.
Why that 12, 13-year hiatus?
I wish it hadn't happened, because I love doing interviews so much. But at some point, the original Thinking Aloud series, which had a great run from 1987 to 2002, that's 15 years, which is unusual actually for a TV series, But at some point,
Mhm.
we ran out of money. And I tried going to Hollywood to see if we could, do something there. But what I ran into was basically a lot of Hollywood producers who got very excited at first, but lost interest quickly. I think when they realized that what we're about is primarily an in-depth intellectual content program, and it didn't match their standards for Hollywood-style entertainment.
Yeah, you're more. It's they call podcasts or longer podcasts long form, but
Yeah.
you're. It's more like long term form. Your format.
During that period from 2002 until 2015, 13 years, I was involved in a variety of other business endeavors and other projects. And so it took a while for me to get back into doing interviews on a regular basis.
Well, I'm thankful that you have, because that's I caught on, like I said, a few years ago on YouTube, some of your shows, and then it brought me, of course, the algorithm shows me more of Jeffrey Mishlove the more I watch him, and it brought me to those older shows in the 80s and 90s. Before we talk about that, you are the as far as I understand, the only PhD parapsychologist, or the only PhD in parapsychology.
Yeah, to be precise, I'm the only person, to my knowledge, in the world who has a doctoral diploma which says parapsychology on it. The truth is, there are hundreds of people who have done doctoral dissertations on parapsychological topics. So my status as a unique individual has to do with the way I approached it. I didn't get a degree in experimental psychology and happen to do a parapsychology project. I created a unique, individual, interdisciplinary doctoral major where I got to define for myself what I meant by parapsychology. And I defined it in a way that's somewhat unique to include, for example, the history of psychic exploration going back to ancient shamanism, to include transpersonal psychology and depth psychology and the spiritual traditions of the world as part of the study. So I think I do look at parapsychology a little differently from people who got their doctoral degrees in an experimental psychology program.
Now, I'm going to ask you something very naive, so you're going to have to excuse it because it's done kind of purposefully. Why?
Why did I decide to pursue a degree? Well,
sorry, let me interrupt with the second part of that question is also, why do something that no one else has done in academia? What was your push?
I wasn't really concerned that to do something whether other people had or had not done it. It's something I wanted to do. When I began looking at it, I realized that there were no other opportunities available back then. I started my academic graduate career out in criminology. I have a master's degree in criminology. If you had known me in 1972, you would see a graduate student doing volunteer work at San Quentin Prison in California in the psychiatric unit, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. And I imagined that my career would involve looking at psychopathology and human deviance and criminology. But then I had a mystical experience. Unexpectedly, a great uncle of mine died. At the moment of his death, I'm in California, he was in Wisconsin, but I had the most powerful dream of my life. You could say it was a shared death experience. It's as if he took me along with him on a journey to the other side. And when I awakened from that dream, I was just crying tears of joy. It was the most beautiful experience. a powerful experience. I was actually singing and crying at the same time. I've never had a dream as powerful as that subsequently.
Sorry, can you describe the dream, or at least share
No,
some
I
details of
can't
the dream?
describe it because it was beyond words. If I was to try and put it into language, it would fall short. That's why when I tell you I was crying tears of joy, well, you have to put yourself into it. You remember when you were crying tears of joy? That would be the closest way I could describe it to you.
No, singing, no, but tears of joy recently, but singing with it, absolutely not.
Tears of joy. And I was singing one of the most sacred songs from my religious tradition of Judaism and crying at the same time. And so I wrote home. I asked my mother, how's Uncle Harry? And she called me as soon as she got the letter. Said, how did you know Uncle Harry just died? And when I began figuring out the moment of his death to the timing of my dream, it was virtually at the same time.
Amazing.
That gave me pause to wonder what just happened here. And I realized that whatever it was that had just happened was sufficiently important that I should spend the rest of my career trying to understand these things. I began discussing it with my professors at Berkeley. I realized quickly none of them had anything intelligent to say about such a thing. And so I vowed to become my own expert. And I struggled over that for months because you could study psychopathology and crime at almost any university, but you can't study mysticism, parapsychology, creativity, and intuition. They don't offer programs normally, at least back then they didn't.
You say something interesting for me. You said there's none could tell you anything intelligent about it. And I'm wondering if it's got to do anything with intelligence, because if they did, they could also have very intelligent things to say against it. And this is not, you didn't have an intellectual experience. You had a mystical, non-intellectual experience. So how can you possibly reason something like that out?
Well, they might have said, that there's a lot of literature about survival after death, but they were ignorant about that. They might have talked about altered states of consciousness or the power of dreams, but they were largely ignorant about that. Eventually, when I ended up creating my own individual major at Berkeley, I was able to find a handful of professors throughout the entire University of California system who were willing to sponsor me to do an interdisciplinary doctoral program. So after a lot of searching, at least I found some professors who thought that this was a viable area of inquiry.
You had, and this is, I don't ask this as a prompt to share the whole story, but by all means, if you want to share parts of it, sure. But I think the point is, because you've said this story over and over, being yours, that there are a lot of roadblocks. And once you were conferred your PhD, that wasn't the end of the story. There was a movement at the university to then retract it, and you had to fight for another 7 or 8 years to confirm that you could keep that PhD.
Well, that's partially correct. There definitely was a movement coming mostly from outside the university to get them to withdraw the degree, because there are people who call themselves skeptics, but I like to think of them as scoffers. A skeptic is a person who first and foremost doubts himself or herself. A true skeptic it would be a scientist who has a theory and does everything they can to see if they can disprove their theory. But these skeptics, or so-called skeptics, people who are hostile to parapsychology, feel they already have the answers, that they know for a fact that the universe follows certain rational principles that could not allow parapsychological phenomena to occur. So they are a priori impossible. And these people put pressure on the university to withdraw my degree. And they failed, as a matter of fact. The university stood behind my degree. But then they tried to slander and libel me. And I fought a libel suit for 6 years, which was eventually settled in my favor.
Wow. So it took you 6 or 7 years to receive that PhD, and then another 6-7 years.
You're correct. I entered the doctoral degree program in 1973. I received my doctoral diploma in 1980. And after I got my diploma, I went to visit my mentor, Arthur M. Young, who was the inventor of the Bell helicopter and a cosmologist. He was also an astrologer. And when I told him, "Oh, I'm so proud I got my doctoral degree," he said, "Well, how long did it take you?" I told him, "Well, basically 6 years." And he pulled out his ephemeris, began running some calculations in his head, and he said to me, "Well, it's going to take you another 6 years to undo all the damage that the university has done to you." And looking back on it, I can say he was right. But it's not that they didn't give me the degree right away. They did. And I had to fight a libel suit, which was painful, but I did that and prevailed. So it was a real battle. But the issue when Arthur Bloch talked to me, I'm sorry, not Arthur Bloch, who was my partner in the original Thinking Aloud series, Arthur Young, who was a mentor to both me and Arthur Bloch, when he said it's going to take you another 6 years to undo the damage that the university has caused, he was referring to a kind of mindset that academics get into, and anybody who goes through academia becomes imprinted with this stamp. And it really did take me a while to stop thinking like a graduate student or, like a would-be academic, and to really find my own voice.
Why did you start interviewing people? What was it? What was it about that style of communication that you chose? Why was it important to you to start that?
After I made the decision to switch out of criminology, out of studying the negative forms of human deviance, and begin looking at the positive forms of human deviance, I really struggled. I looked around. I thought, well, maybe there's a program here in the university I can move into, or at some other college or university. And I discovered there were none that I could find. I didn't know what to do. I agonized over this for months. And then one day, I said to myself, I'm going to find the answer to this search, and it's going to come to me tonight in a dream. It was like a certainty. I knew, an intuition. I knew this was going to happen, and it did. I had a dream. I was visiting some friends in Berkeley, California, where I lived, knocked on the door of their apartment. There was no answer. Nobody was home. I found a key in my dream and let myself in. And there on the living room floor of the apartment, I found a magazine called EYE. And I began paging through the magazine when I woke up from the dream with this feeling of exhilaration, like, aha, I've got it now. But I had no idea what it meant. So I actually acted out the dream. I put on my tennis shoes. I ran 5 miles across town, came to this particular apartment, knocked on the door, and as I had dreamt, no answer. No one was home. And so I happened to know where they hid a key. And I found that key, let myself into the apartment, walked into the living room, and right on the middle of the living room floor, as I had dreamt, was a magazine wide open on the floor. I picked it up, began reading through it. It was called Focus, and it turned out to be the magazine of the local listener-sponsored KQED radio and TV in the National Public Radio and Public Television in the San Francisco Bay Area. As I was paging through the magazine, it dawned on me for the first time in my life that I could pursue my interests by getting involved in the nonprofit section of the media, which was a total shift for me. I did not own a radio or a television at that point in my life. And furthermore, I didn't believe in electronic communication. I was this long-haired hippie.
Wow, you were a hippie, yeah.
Who believed that electronic communication was all phony baloney. And I changed my mind at that moment. I went over to KPFA Radio in Berkeley, where I live, nonprofit station of the Pacifica Radio Network. And I said, I'm here, I'll volunteer, I'll do anything. And they said, well, good. We need somebody to sit here at this desk. And when you hear the buzzer ring from the doorbell, press this button and let people in the front door. And even though I had my master's degree at the time, I was happy to do that. And within 3 weeks, I had learned how to produce a radio program. I had done my first program on how you don't have to be from out of town to be psychic, because I had a lot of local friends who were psychic people. And the program director liked it so much, he said, well, we've got a regular slot for you every Tuesday and Thursday at noon. Would you mind hosting this program called The Mind's Ear? And it's an interview program. And so within a few weeks of my dream, I found myself sitting across a table interviewing the leading experts in the fields that interested me the most, who were traveling through the San Francisco Bay Area on their book tours, because KPFA was one of the most powerful stations in the San Francisco area. We got all the best authors. And that's what gave me the confidence then to go back to the university and create the individual interdisciplinary doctoral program, because I realized I now had access to the best minds in the country on the topics that interested me the most. And that's how I began my work as an interviewer in 1972.
Yeah, when I asked you, why do you do what you do, when we talked about interviews, you said, on one hand, it's a passion, but on the other hand, I've been guided. It's a partnership in some mysterious way.
Well, the way I tell it to people is that if you strive to become the best version of yourself, to do, one way to think of it is to say to do the things you contracted to do before you were born. Mm-hmm. That, if you to realize your highest potential, the universe is going to help you. The universe wants you to do that. And so when I made this commitment to stop focusing on the negative side of human deviance, but to focus on the positive side of human deviance, I think the universe reached out to me through these dreams.
I really like this, the positive side of human deviance. It's not something I've heard until I started listening to you. Let's connect that back to your upbringing with your family, because you grew up, you grew up in the Jewish faith. You said your uncle was very religious, but your family, I don't even know if I should say but. This is why actually I'm asking the question to you. But your family is very mystical. There's a lot of mysticism in your family. What is mysticism, and can it get along with religious tradition?
The mysticism that existed in my family was largely hidden from me at this time in my life in 1972. My great uncle Harry was 50 years older than me. Yeah. when he died, I asked, could I have a book of his to remember him by? Actually, I didn't even say a book. I said some object of his. And I was sent a book. And the book turned out to be, I was told, Uncle Harry's favorite book, a little book. And it was in Yiddish, a very obscure language spoken by Jews in Eastern Europe, and sort of a hybrid of German and Hebrew. So the book was written in Yiddish, Hebrew characters, but sort of a Germanic slang language. And I had to have it translated, of course. And I learned that the book was really called The Tales of Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of what is known as the Hasidic tradition in Judaism. It's a mystical tradition going back to the 17th and 18th century in Eastern Europe. And it was then I realized that my great uncle Harry was a mystic. This was his favorite book. But in growing up in America in the 1950s, as I did, Jewish people hid this. We never talked about anything mystical associated with Judaism. The whole point of being brought up in a Jewish family in the 1950s in America was you want to blend in. You want to be like everybody else. You don't want to call attention to yourself as being different from other people. So the mystical side of Judaism was completely hidden. I never learned of Uncle Harry's interest in it until after he died. And then sometime around then, my mother decided to become a yoga teacher, and she ended up teaching yoga for 30 years before she died. But then again, I didn't know about any of that at the time. Yoga was a rarity back in those days.
Just to go back a little bit to that part of the story about hiding this part, the real part of your family's traditions, I can make the link to my own experience through my cultural background. So being of Italian descent, we grew up church-going Catholics, but you always understood that there was something more and something different. So it started off as learning that there were superstitions in the family, and that there were people who could practice the canceling out of bad spells, so to speak. But it was kind of on the hush-hush, the women in the family would know the chants or the secrets or so forth. And so it would only pop up every once in a while. Only when I became a young adult did I understand that there is a pervasiveness of this kind of this. I'm going to call it mystical. Maybe I'm being romantic about it, but it was in Europe, at least in Western, Southern Europe, because it's been my experience. There was a stamping out of shamanic or mystical practices by the church for hundreds of years. But it's always remained there, hiding, always remained there. So that's why I ask you, should I use but, like religion but mystical, religion and mystical, this sorts of things that interest me. You mentioned also Arthur Young. I want to go back to him because he came up in a conversation very recently on the podcast. I forgot who brought him up. It'll come to me. Arthur Young was the inventor of the helicopter.
The first commercially licensed helicopter. It's the little Bell helicopter with the glass bubble and the
Magnum PI.
And he also invented the idea of skids, that the helicopters landed on skids rather than on wheels.
And how did he become your mentor? What was the bridge there?
Even before I was a parapsychologist, even in criminology, there were graduate students who got together at Berkeley who were interested in consciousness. And they came from different departments, psychology or neurology, medicine, and philosophy. And we would have little meetings. And one of the graduate students, a fellow named Kenneth Pelletier, who has been interviewed on New Thinking Aloud, was close to Arthur Young. And Arthur Young was in the East Coast, but he wanted to establish a center of his organization the Institute for the Study of Consciousness in Berkeley. So he came out to Berkeley and offered a few seminars. And then when he opened up his institute, he bought a property in Berkeley to do that. And he and his wife moved in. They spent half a year living there. And they invited me and one of my close friends, Saul Paul Sirag, to move into the institute with them. So we did. And he became a very important mentor to me in those years.
He was a leader of industry, an engineer, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
is that right?
He was a self-taught person. He got his degree in Princeton University in 1926, if I remember correctly. His undergraduate degree studying Einstein's theory of relativity, which was sort of brand new at the time. And after he graduated from college, he decided that he wanted to be a philosopher, but he felt that in order to be worthy of being a philosopher, he felt it was important to prove that he could master some physical world problem, because he felt philosophy was bankrupt and that there had been all of this progress in technology that was unanticipated by philosophers and not addressed by them. And he felt in order to be worthy of being a true philosopher, he needed to show that he could master a technological problem. So he went to the patent office in Washington to find out what were the major unsolved problems of that day. And he came upon the fact that there had been over 200 efforts to build a machine that could hover in midair and move in any direction. And so he decided he would set out to build that machine. 200 failures. And so that's in 1926. He started to do that. It took until 1947. He worked on it in his barn in Pennsylvania. He had a barn, and he began building toy models of helicopters. He worked for most of that time on a design that was completely impractical and didn't work. But by the mid-1940s, he had come up with a toy model that actually flew and would hover in midair. And so he took that to the Bell Aircraft Corporation, and he said, let's make a big one. And they did. And so it was released in 1947 as the Bell Model 47, the first commercially licensed helicopter. You know, they were called whirlybirds back in those days. I remember as a young child seeing helicopters. They were a rarity back in like when I was 4 years old in 1950. You didn't see them very often, but there they were. And of course, they became practically universal since then. And after completing that, building the helicopter, he decided to go back to his original love of philosophy and cosmology. And he developed I would call it a new paradigm, a model of thinking about all of the sciences, all of human knowledge in a different way. His classic book about that is called The Reflexive Universe. It's a masterpiece. It's really a brilliant book.
So he was your mentor for a number of years, for a decade. Is
really,
that right?
I met him in about 1972. Well, I moved into the Institute in 1973, and he died in 1995. So during that period, over 20 years, we were very close.
You said in another interview, children have a natural sense of the mysticism or of mysticism. Well, explain.
Well, children are closer, you could say, to the spiritual world. They've just emerged from it. And for example, young children, many of them, as soon as they can begin to talk, begin describing their past lifetimes. as one example, or describing what life was like before they were born. And oftentimes adults don't listen to this kind of talk. They think, well, the young child is just prattling away. But if you pay attention to what young children have to say, you can learn some things about the spiritual world.
It reminds me of a conversation we had with Thomas Verney, Dr. Thomas Verney, who I know was on your show as well. And in and around that time that we recorded, I had a meeting with a friend of mine in Rome, or close to Rome, and it was the first time that I met his wife and child. So he was working, but he brought his wife and child with him because they were kind of going between city to city to go on vacation. So anyway, so I met them. We were at a bar outside, a coffee bar outside. She was 9 at the time, the child. It was the first time I met her. We all sat down, and she sat at the head of the table. And she turned to me like an adult and says, "So how are you?" I said, "I'm doing well. How are you?" And I turned directly to the mother. I said, "Was she precocious when she was younger? Did she say things that surprised you?" And it completely opened up the conversation. She says, "Oh yeah." And she started to rhyme off examples of the things that she used to say that the father, who my friend, didn't even know. He had no idea because he's blocked these sorts of things out. And one of the things she said when she was 4, she said, "I remember before I met you and Daddy, I had to go down the slide of forgetfulness." So that stuck with me. But learning from Thomas Verney and then Antonia Mills that precocious children, so children who are very vocal and seem to be very mature for their age at that young age, do tend to share more of these things, these memories. There's something about the memories that stick. Is that your experience as a parapsychologist having?
Well, it of course depends a lot on the child. It turns out, for example, that at the University of Virginia, they study this. They have in their files over 2,500 cases of young children who report past life memories. And most of those are from previous lifetimes that involved a violent death. So I think the type of death you experienced in your previous life will have something to do with how readily those memories can come to you, even as a young child.
Do you believe in reincarnation?
I don't think it's so much a question of belief as it is looking at the evidence. And when you look at the evidence of these cases of the 2,500 children who have reported past life memories, we know now that some 1,700 of them are considered solved cases where the children has provided enough information so that researchers or parents are able to actually identify who the previous person was and where they lived. Often the child goes and meets the previous family and begins calling people by their pet names and telling stories that only the deceased person could have known. So the evidence definitely points to reincarnation as something that can occur. That doesn't mean that everybody reincarnates. We don't know that for sure, but it does seem to be something that occurs some of the time.
When you pass, when you die, you told me this. You told me this the last time we chatted. You believe that consciousness continues.
Yes.
What choice would you make if there were choices to be made when your consciousness continues? What choice would you make?
Well, I don't want to preclude that I might change my mind. You know more. You're more well informed as to making the right choice. I think people have a basic choice is whether you're going to move on in various spiritual realms, whether you're going to reincarnate on Earth. Maybe you'll reincarnate elsewhere, not on this planet, but in some other location, or maybe you'll just sort of blend and merge into the great cosmic mind. So I think there are different choices that people are confronted with, and I expect I'll I'll make the right choice at the right time. But I don't think I know enough right now to make an informed choice. There's so many opportunities and they all seem so tempting.
Did you always believe in the continuation of consciousness, or is this something that you've come to believe from your work?
Well, the experience I had with Uncle Harry, that dream that occurred to me in 1972, left me with no doubt that something quite remarkable is occurring. And we can call it postmortem survival. That is probably as good an explanation as anything, but it does suggest a much richer understanding of the nature of reality. And maybe the better way to phrase it is not that I believe in survival, but I believe in consciousness itself as the ground of being. The conventional view that most educated people in Western countries are brought up to believe is that the bedrock of reality are these little particles, atoms and molecules and subatomic particles bouncing around, and that reality is fundamentally material. However, the founder of quantum physics, Max Planck, once said, no, the foundation of reality is consciousness itself. You can't get underneath consciousness. And that's hard for people to grasp. We're so accustomed to thinking in material terms.
Yeah. That's why it's hard for people to grasp. I think it's a pretty simple thing, although really it isn't. It's our beliefs. And it's incredible how much it takes for us to shift or change our beliefs when beliefs aren't material. But beliefs are not physical, but they are the hardest, most immovable thing for many of us. And sometimes it takes a personal experience like yours, and sometimes it takes just the belief that others' experiences are real. When those of us that are entrenched in the belief, so in the non-material reality that consciousness does not exist, that's when people like you in your work come up against lots of roadblocks and vehement fight back. And you gave a story that I listened to recently about you asked somebody a question from the crowd after listening to a talk about ESP.
Maybe you're thinking of the time that Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer, came to Berkeley and gave a talk. And I was a student in the crowd. This would have been about 1973, in which Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic, had been in the news a lot. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at SRI International had published a paper in Nature talking about Uri Geller's psychic abilities. It was a landmark paper. And then Arthur Clarke wrote an article in Time magazine, as I recall, saying that he didn't believe in all of these things. And it's strange because if you read some of his novels, they're very descriptive regarding paranormal activity and ESP. So I raised my hand and I said to him, Mr. Clarke, do you believe in ESP? And I thought his answer was incredibly revealing. He said, no, I do not believe in ESP because I don't want anybody to read my mind. And I understood then that he was giving away the secret as to why so many people are threatened by the possibility of ESP. If you think about it, Sigmund Freud developed his whole theory of the subconscious mind, being that there are things we don't want to know about ourselves. We don't want to know what's in our own mind. So we develop suppression, we develop repression, we develop all of these Freudian defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from knowing about ourselves. And if we don't want to know about what's in our own mind, of course, we don't want other people to know. It's a basic human psychological dynamic going on there. And then, of course, if you begin to study more deeply the biography of Arthur C. Clarke, you'll understand that he probably had even other additional reasons for not wanting people to read his mind.
For me, that's a mini tragedy, maybe a major one. I don't know. I have to think about that. But it is a tragedy because in that example, Arthur C. Clarke was being truthful. He didn't understand that he was actually being truthful in his answer, because it was cloaked in the lies that I'm not picking on him, but people like that who give those kinds of responses, that they cloak the truth with lies. And it's the lie of not believing it because it's not true, not because they're afraid it might be true.
Yeah, I know that was very forthright of him to put it that way. And it was kind of funny in the way he said it, but it points to a deep psychological reality. That is, until the human race evolves to a point where we're not afraid of our own unconscious, are we ever going to be willing to accept the possibility that other people can read our thoughts?
Why do you believe there is such a strong belief? So let's see if we can, I want to explore beyond this. Why is there such a strong belief in the third dimension reality, in the physical? Why? Why are we holding on to it so much?
Well, it's very seductive. And we get reinforcement all the time from, for example, television. And for example, our consumer economy is dependent upon people believing, just as a simple example, that you're not going to be complete if you don't brush your teeth 2 or 3 times a day and put on deodorant and eye makeup. And you have to have a nice car, and you have to have a television set, and you have to work for all of these things. So we're constantly bombarded by advertisements talking about all the benefits of material goods in our lives. And so people come to believe that, as sometimes the way it's put is that the winner is he who dies with the most toys. If you've ever heard that phrase.
Yes.
That's like the goal of life is to accumulate the most. And it becomes very seductive because, the toys are a lot of fun. And of course, in toys include, you want to have a beautiful wife, you want to have an impressive house, you want to be able to do this and that, and you can travel, and you can dine at the finest restaurants and satisfy yourself through the accumulation of material goods. Many people feel that that's what life is all about.
We live a hypocritical life because most of us find our greatest joy in absorbed in doing or consuming our favorite art, our paintings, our music, our acting. These are not material things, but most of us find immense joy in these things, which contradicts the immense joy that we think we have when we own physical things.
That's true. There are many people who derive pleasure from spiritual realities. I mean, think of all the monks who take a vow of poverty and live a life of meditation and contemplation. They're typically very happy people. So I don't claim, of course, that materialism is really the source of our happiness, but many people get seduced into thinking that.
Why do human beings create art?
Well, I'm sure there are many different reasons. If you talk to different artists, they'll all give you different answers. But I can speak for myself. I created this logo of the Thinking Aloud or New Thinking Aloud, the rainbow yin yang, and it came to me spontaneously years ago. Now we even have animated versions of it. But for me, art is something that comes from a deep place within and then emerges through me. So it's a way of getting in touch with something very, very deep within yourself. I can't say that every artist has that same motivation, but it's certainly one of the important aspects of artistic creation.
Why? Why do you think it exists there? Why do you think that deep at the core of the person exists that need, that desire to do art?
Why do we have a deep inner being?
Maybe that it could be asked that way too. I don't know.
Yeah, for some people, it's not art. I mean, not everybody creates art. Some people devote their whole life to charity. Some people devote their whole life to science. It's not art for everybody. Some people are gifted in music or mathematics. So the way I think of it, as I expressed to you before, is the goal is ultimately to become the best version of yourself, which means getting in touch with that. One of my mentors is a wonderful woman named Jean Houston, who liked to use the Greek word entelechy. Entelechy is kind of an inner purpose. Each one of us is born with an inner purpose. And for some people, it will be to create art. For other people, it might be to be an interviewer or a parapsychologist or to go into politics. It's hard to say. But when I talk about becoming the best version of yourself, it's about discovering your inner purpose and then realizing it.
Maybe then I shouldn't have asked it that way, using the word art. Maybe it's just creation. Why is it that we need to create? Because an interviewer or an engineer or scientist, they use their imagination to create a goal of sorts.
Just being a parent, you create a human being. That's an act of creativity as well. And even people like who go into solitude, if you become a hermit your whole life and live in a cave, that's also a form of creativity, actually. And the early desert fathers of the first century who did exactly that were important cultural creatives. They invented monastic culture. So what I'm suggesting is that we are put on this planet for each of us for a reason, where it's not just blind accident. Everybody is born for a reason. And to the extent that we can discover that reason and actualize it, it makes life all that much more satisfying and joyful.
What's your reason?
Well, I'm pretty sure that my purpose on being here is to be a communicator to the world at large about the realities of psychic and mystical life.
Why don't we know the source of the reasons, the actual information that indicates the origins of our existence? Why these things exist? Why is it that curiosity even exists? Why don't we just know?
Well, I think we do, but we may not know that we know. And that is, we get caught up in language. The whole notion of thinking means putting words together. We think with language. And the problem with language is wonderful. That's what you and I are doing right now, is we're using language. But words are not the things that they signify. If I try and describe a mystical experience in words, the words can only point towards that. They are never the thing itself. And so to the extent that we try to describe ultimate reality in words, we always fall short. The only way to really know, for example, the purpose of life is to be it, to act it out, not to talk about it or think about it.
Why does the veil exist? And maybe that's the same question. Humor me.
It's another way of looking at the same question. And I think one way to think about it is to look at what is the most popular game that children in every culture around the world play. I would submit that it is hide and go seek. And that's what we're doing with ourselves. We are divine beings embodied in this mortal frame, and we're hiding from ourselves in a way. We're playing hide and go seek with ourselves. The goal is to discover that we are these immortal divine beings in human bodies, but we can get lost in the human world and forget about our divine origin. So you could say it's a game we're playing with ourselves.
I had a conversation with somebody very recently, maybe a couple of months ago, phone conversation. We had never met before. We were introduced, and he was sharing some of his thoughts, some of his beliefs on a question that I had asked him. It wasn't an interview or anything. And I started to get a buzz, a physical buzz, and I was getting emotional. And I wasn't sad. I was actually very joyful. And I felt this person doesn't know that I went through this, but I felt in that instant a connection with this individual that was beyond the phone call. I could not describe it. Again, emotional, tearful, joyful, and an immense connection. And I've never met this person since. I've never met this person live. It's an indication to me personally that there is a hide and seek, use your words, actively being played out in my everyday, because it felt like, I don't know what it is, it felt like I found something that was hidden until those words were told to me. And then it was an immediate grand treasure find. It was instantaneous and impactful. It was, and I could not reason it out. It was emotional. It was impactful. I'm just sharing that because you said hide and seek, and it just came to me. It just came to me. I know we allotted a certain amount of time here, and we're getting towards the end of the conversation. So I'll end off by asking you one last question. What is greatness to you?
Well, one way to think about greatness would be, who has had the most influence in the world? When I was an undergraduate in college, I used to have these discussions with my college roommate, and he would say, well, the greatest people in the world are the ones who've had the most influence, like Chairman Mao. He changed, the most populous country in the world. He changed it from a kind of feudal society to a communist culture, affecting over 1 billion people. That's real power. Or even Henry VIII, the king who changed the whole religion of his country from Roman Catholicism to the Anglican religion. That's enormous power. So that's a form of greatness. And, that's sort of greatness in the outer world. Other people would say the really great people are the spiritual teachers, the Christs and the Buddhas, even the Mohammeds and so on of the world. I'd be inclined to think that some of the greatest people may be the ones we'll never recognize, the people who were just totally loving. To me, that would be a sign of greatness. Humble people who devote their lives to love and affection for the people who are close to them, who never seek recognition. They're not trying to attain sainthood or power or glory. They're just here to express love. I feel blessed in a way that I was born into a family that was very loving. And I think of those people, my aunts and uncles and parents, that will never be remembered as great people, but they were totally loving people. To me, that's the highest form of greatness.
You said something also earlier that I wrote down. I'm looking at this word. I haven't said or written this word in many, many years. And it's also something very simple. Not as simple as what you've just said, because what you've just said is very powerful. That we need to be skeptical, but we can't be scoffing. And I think again, I don't want to be romantic about this, but you've lived a life where you've seen a lot of scoffing. You came up against a lot of scoffing, but you still understood, I guess, that you were living a life of hide and seek, and you needed to seek. And one of the last things you said to me in our last conversation is that you started off as a seeker. Go figure. You started off as a seeker, but you don't have any more burning questions. But I think what's important, because I want you to comment on that very quickly. I think that's I promise you one last thing beforehand. Now, this is the last thing. But I think it's because you've had, and I've heard many of your interviews, is that you've been skeptical, but not dismissive. And that allows the listener or the person watching, the viewer, permission to continue listening and watching.
I think it's important to treat all people with kindness and respect, even people that you disagree with, even people who are criminals. I worked with criminals early in my career. I think they deserve as much respect for their humanity as any other person. We're all human beings. And that what irritates me the most is the horse laugh, people who just try to, dismiss you without ever having to consider or think about what you have to say, because it's so ridiculous to them. So I particularly like to focus on areas that I call of high strangeness, things that are so strange that your instinctive response is to say, that can't possibly be true. Those are the things that are often the most important to take a good look at.
Jeffrey, thank you again so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you as well.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.